The room went silent. Not the normal quiet of a formal event, but the kind of silence that feels heavy, the kind that makes people stop breathing mid-sentence. Cameras flashed rapidly. A soft murmur rippled through the ballroom as executives in tailored suits leaned forward in their seats. Investors adjusted their glasses. Reporters lifted their microphones slightly higher. Everyone sensed something important was happening. At the center of the elevated stage stood Victor Langston, a billionaire real estate mogul whose name was stamped across skylines in 3 major cities. His company, Langston Global Developments, had reshaped urban infrastructure, luxury living, and commercial districts worldwide. With a net worth exceeding $3 billion and deep political connections, Victor carried himself like a man who had never once been told no. His custom-made charcoal suit fit perfectly. His silver cufflinks gleamed under the lights. His expression held the quiet confidence of someone used to controlling every room he entered. Standing beside him was Danielle Carter. Calm, composed, unshaken. She wore a navy blue power suit, simple but sharp. No flashy jewelry, no dramatic gestures, just quiet authority. As the newly appointed senior federal compliance director, she had been assigned to oversee corporate infrastructure partnerships, including the federal contracts that helped fund Victor's multi-billion-dollar developments. Her credentials were impeccable, her record spotless. But in that moment, none of that was visible. What was visible was her extended hand. "Mr. Langston," she said politely, her voice steady and professional. Looking forward to working together. It was a simple gesture, a routine courtesy, the kind exchanged thousands of times in rooms just like this. Victor looked at her hand, then at her face. His expression shifted, not dramatically, just subtly enough for those paying attention to notice. And slowly, he kept his hands at his sides. A faint smirk touched the corner of his lips. "I don't think that will be necessary," he said coldly. The words landed like a dropped glass. The audience froze. One photographer lowered his camera slightly. An executive in the front row blinked in disbelief. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. It lasted only seconds, but to everyone watching, it felt like minutes. Danielle didn't react the way some might have expected. She didn't pull back sharply. She didn't argue. She didn't show embarrassment. Instead, she slowly lowered her hand with controlled grace. Her expression remained neutral, unreadable. "Understood," she replied calmly. "Then let's proceed with the review. No emotion, no hesitation, just professionalism." Victor leaned back slightly satisfied. In his mind, he had just set the tone. He believed he had established dominance in front of investors, media, and government officials. To him, it was a small gesture, a subtle reminder of who he thought held power. But what he failed to recognize was something far more significant. That handshake wasn't about politeness. It wasn't about tradition. It was about mutual respect within a system built on accountability. And in that system, Danielle Carter held authority that didn't need to raise its voice. Victor believed power was measured in skyscrapers, stock prices, and political favors. What he didn't realize, not yet, was that real power sometimes stands quietly beside you waiting. And Danielle had far more of it than he knew. Danielle Carter wasn't just another government official. She wasn't someone who climbed the ladder through favors or connections. She had built her reputation the hard way, through discipline, long nights, and relentless attention to detail. Years earlier, she had graduated at the top of her class from Harvard Law School. Professors described her as surgical in her arguments. While others debated loudly, Danielle listened carefully and then dismantled complex legal problems with calm precision. Her specialty wasn't flashy courtroom drama. It was something far more dangerous to corporations trying to bend the rules. Financial compliance, international asset regulation, corporate transparency law, fields that most executives found boring, until those fields started freezing accounts. Over the last decade, Danielle had helped uncover more than $12 billion in fraudulent activity across major corporations. Hidden offshore networks, misreported federal guarantees, shell companies layered so carefully they looked legitimate at first glance. She didn't rush investigations. She didn't make emotional accusations. She followed numbers, and numbers rarely lied. Quietly, legally, precisely. But Victor Langston hadn't bothered to research any of that. To him, Danielle was simply a newly appointed official assigned to observe his company's operations. A procedural inconvenience. A box to check before the next expansion deal. His company, Langston Global Developments, was deeply intertwined with federal infrastructure partnerships. Highways, commercial districts, luxury housing projects partially backed by government incentive programs. They also relied heavily on overseas investment credits and strategic international tax structures, completely legal when disclosed properly. And Danielle's department oversaw every inch of it. After the conference incident, Victor returned to his private executive lounge with several board members. Crystal glasses clinked softly as they poured expensive, sparkling water. "She won't last 6 months," Victor joked confidently. "These compliance people always come in trying to prove something." A few board members laughed politely. One didn't, because seasoned executives knew something Victor's ego ignored. Compliance directors didn't need to prove anything. They just needed paperwork. Across town, long after the conference lights dimmed, Danielle sat alone in her office. The city skyline glowed outside her floor-to-ceiling windows. A single desk lamp illuminated neatly stacked files beside her laptop. No dramatic music. No anger. No reaction to the earlier disrespect. Just focus. She opened Langston Global's financial disclosures. At first glance, everything appeared polished, professional, carefully organized. But Danielle didn't skim. She cross-referenced. She compared international filings with domestic reports. She examined timestamps. And then she noticed something interesting. Offshore holding accounts registered in subsidiary names. Delayed disclosure forms submitted days after regulatory deadlines. Asset transfers that moved through multiple entities before settling. Individually, none of it was illegal. Not yet. But patterns tell stories. And this pattern felt intentional. A slight tightening of her expression was the only sign she had noticed something unusual. "Interesting," she murmured quietly to herself. She didn't pick up the phone. She didn't draft accusations. She didn't think about the handshake. Because this wasn't personal. This was structural. Danielle understood something Victor did not. Corporations rarely collapse because of dramatic scandals. They collapse because of small technical violations that expose larger vulnerabilities. She opened a new file on her computer. Langston Global Preliminary Review. Then she requested internal authorization to initiate a deeper examination. Not a raid. Not a headline. A full compliance audit. Strategic. Thorough. Lawful. And once that process began, it couldn't simply be stopped with influence or charm. Victor thought she was reacting emotionally. He thought she was trying to prove something. But Danielle wasn't reacting. She was building a case, line by line, transaction by transaction. And by the time Victor realized what was happening, it would already be too late. Because Danielle Carter didn't chase power. She enforced it. 2 weeks later, Langston Global's executive headquarters received a sealed federal envelope. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. But it carried weight. Stamped clearly across the top were the words, "Federal Asset Compliance Review initiated." The document was precise, formal, unemotional, and legally powerful. When Victor Langston read it, his jaw tightened. Within minutes, he stormed into the executive boardroom. The letter crumpled slightly in his grip. The glass walls reflected his anger as board members looked up from tablets and reports. He threw the document onto the polished table. "This is harassment," he snapped. "A waste of federal resources." His voice echoed sharply in the room. Some executives shifted uncomfortably. Others remained silent. But his legal team didn't share his confidence. They looked nervous. Very nervous. Because they understood something Victor didn't. Federal compliance reviews don't begin without foundation. And by the time Victor realized what was happening, it would already be too late. Because Danielle Carter didn't chase power. She enforced it. 2 weeks later, Langston Global's executive headquarters received a sealed federal envelope. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic, but it carried weight. Stamped clearly across the top were the words, Federal Asset Compliance Review initiated. The document was precise, formal, unemotional, and legally powerful. When Victor Langston read it, his jaw tightened. Within minutes, he stormed into the executive boardroom. The letter crumpled slightly in his grip. The glass walls reflected his anger as board members looked up from tablets and reports. He threw the document onto the polished table. "This is harassment," he snapped. "A waste of federal resources." His voice echoed sharply in the room. Some executives shifted uncomfortably. Others remained silent. But his legal team didn't share his confidence. They looked nervous, very nervous, because they understood something Victor didn't. Federal compliance reviews don't begin without foundation. Danielle Carter wasn't speculating. She had documentation. Over the next month, her department worked methodically. Teams of analysts combed through financial disclosures. Every international wire transfer was traced. Every subsidiary cross-checked. Every tax credit claim compared against federal guidelines. They examined shell corporations registered overseas. They analyzed holding structures layered through multiple countries. They reviewed time-stamped filings against regulatory deadlines. It wasn't dramatic. It was meticulous, and that's what made it dangerous. Then, buried within international development filings, they found it. 3 holding accounts, legally structured, but never properly disclosed in federal transparency forms. The accounts were tied to overseas luxury developments partially supported by federal-backed guarantees. The total exposure? Nearly $3 billion in leveraged assets. Technically, the assets themselves were valid. The properties existed. The investments were real. But under federal compliance law, failure to properly disclose leveraged holdings connected to government-backed funding triggered automatic enforcement authority. It wasn't about criminal fraud. It was about regulatory violation. And regulatory violations carry consequences. Danielle reviewed the final summary report herself. She read every page carefully before signing the authorization. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. At exactly 9 a.m. on a Monday morning, the enforcement order was executed. Victor's phone rang while he was reviewing expansion proposals. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, neutral. "Mr. Langston, due to non-compliance with federal asset transparency regulations, $3 billion in leverage holdings are temporarily frozen pending investigation." For a moment, Victor thought he misheard. "Frozen," he repeated sharply. "You can't do that." There was a pause, not of uncertainty, but of protocol. "We already have." The line went silent. Victor stared at his phone. Within 30 minutes, financial markets began reacting. Analysts noticed restricted asset movements. News of a federal review spread quickly across investor networks. Langston Global's stock price dipped, then dropped further. Investors started calling. Board members demanded emergency meetings. Media outlets began preparing headlines. In the executive office, overlooking the skyline he once felt he owned, Victor stood still. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not arrogance, uncertainty. Because this wasn't an emotional retaliation. This wasn't public embarrassment. This wasn't someone trying to prove a point. This was structured enforcement, legal precision. Every document signed, every regulation cited, every procedure followed. Danielle hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made threats. She had simply applied the law. And in doing so, she had done something Victor never expected anyone could do. She made $3 billion untouchable. Not because she wanted revenge, but because the rules required it, and she had played by them flawlessly. News spread fast. By the end of the day, every major financial outlet carried the headline. Billionaire mogul faces $3 billion asset freeze. Business channels ran breaking news banners. Analysts debated what it meant for the market. Social media exploded with opinions, speculation, and commentary. For years, Victor Langston had been known as a symbol of unstoppable growth, a man who built skylines and influenced policy meetings behind closed doors. Now, his name was being discussed for a different reason. Reporters began digging. Old interviews resurfaced. Past expansion deals were re-examined. Questions emerged about aggressive acquisition strategies and unusually fast-tracked development approvals. Some critics suggested political favoritism. Others questioned how certain overseas projects had scaled so quickly. Nothing criminal had been proven, but perception in the financial world is powerful. And perception was shifting. Inside Langston Global Headquarters, executives moved quickly to control the narrative. Public relations teams drafted statements. Lawyers reviewed talking points. But one person remained completely silent. Danielle Carter. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't release a statement. She didn't respond to media requests for interviews. While headlines grew louder, she did the opposite. She continued her work. Files remained open on her desk. Investigators continued reviewing compliance documents. Meetings were scheduled. Procedures were followed. To Danielle, the noise didn't matter. The law did. Meanwhile, pressure mounted on Victor from every direction. Investors wanted reassurance. Board members demanded clarity. Partners requested private calls. For the first time in years, he wasn't controlling the room. So he did something he rarely did. He requested a private meeting with Danielle Carter. No press, no assistants, no legal teams, just the two of them. The meeting was scheduled in a neutral federal conference room. Polished wooden table, floor-to-ceiling windows. Quiet, controlled. When Victor entered, his posture was different. Still confident but measured. Danielle was already seated, a thin folder placed neatly in front of her. She looked composed as always. He took his seat across from her. No cameras this time. No flashing lights. No audience to impress. Victor cleared his throat. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he began, choosing his words carefully. Danielle met his gaze evenly. "There was no misunderstanding, Mr. Langston," she replied calmly. "Only missing disclosures." Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was factual. Victor shifted slightly in his chair. The room felt smaller than he remembered. "You could have handled this differently," he said, attempting to regain control of the conversation. There was a brief pause. Danielle didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She simply responded with quiet strength. "I offered professionalism from the start." The words settled heavily between them. In that moment, Victor replayed the conference stage in his mind. The extended hand he ignored, the smirk, the public dismissal. He had believed that gesture demonstrated power. Now he understood something else. Authority doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't demand validation. It operates within structure. Respect isn't optional in rooms where authority is earned. It's foundational. And for the first time since the asset freeze, Victor fully grasped the truth. This was never about personal pride. It was never about embarrassment. It wasn't about a handshake. It was about accountability. And accountability doesn't negotiate with ego. 3 months later, the storm had settled, at least on the surface. Langston Global agreed to pay substantial financial penalties for disclosure violations. The company announced a complete restructuring of its financial reporting systems. New compliance officers were hired. International holdings were reorganized. Transparency protocols were strengthened. Press releases described it as a strategic adjustment. But those who followed the story closely knew better. It was correction under pressure. Gradually, the frozen assets were reinstated, but not without conditions. Strict federal compliance monitoring remained in place. Quarterly audits became mandatory. Every major transaction now required detailed reporting and verification. The message was clear. Oversight wasn't temporary. It was permanent. Financially, Victor survived. But reputationally, something had shifted. For years, investors had viewed him as untouchable, a visionary builder who always won. Now they saw something different. They saw that even billion-dollar empires answer to regulation. They saw vulnerability. And in the corporate world, perception is everything. Victor adjusted his public tone. Interviews became more measured. Statements more cautious. Expansion plans slowed, replaced by stabilization efforts. He had learned, publicly, that power without accountability is fragile. And Danielle? She didn't change at all. If anything, her reputation strengthened. Within regulatory and legal circles, she became known as a symbol of disciplined leadership. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just consistent. At a national corporate ethics forum later that year, Danielle was invited to speak on transparency in large-scale infrastructure partnerships. The auditorium was filled with executives, regulators, journalists, and business students. Cameras recorded every word. During the Q&A session, a reporter stood up. "Ms. Carter," he began, "many people believe the asset freeze was connected to what happened at the conference that day. Did you freeze his assets because of that incident?" The room grew quiet. Danielle paused briefly, not to search for an answer, but to measure her words carefully. A slight smile appeared on her face. "No," she said calmly. "I froze assets because the law required it." There was no sarcasm, no emotion, just truth. Then she added something that would echo far beyond that auditorium. Respect in business isn't symbolic. It's structural. Within hours, the clip spread across social media. News outlets replayed it. Business analysts quoted it in opinion pieces. Across boardrooms nationwide, executives watched carefully because the message wasn't dramatic. It was instructional. Bias, whether subtle or obvious, can cloud judgment. Underestimating someone based on assumptions can distort risk assessment. And in high-stakes environments, distorted judgment is expensive, very expensive. Underestimating the wrong person doesn't just bruise pride. It can cost billions. Back in her quiet office overlooking the city skyline, Danielle continued her work as she always had. Files organized, reports reviewed, policies enforced. No celebración, no victory speech, no personal spotlight, just structure. Because true power doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't raise its voice. It simply acts. And when it acts with discipline, integrity, and law behind it, it doesn't shake hands to prove authority. It enforces it.